Long before Hitler invaded Poland, unleashing World War II, the Imperial Japanese Army was already committing large-scale genocide on the Chinese mainland. One of the Japanese Army's most feared detachments was known simply as Unit 731. For the hundreds of thousands of prisoners unfortunate enough to end up in Unit 731, it meant much more than just a number. There, they were subjected to all manner of torture devices operated by grey men in white coats who had no respect for human dignity or life. For 10 years, Unit 731 conducted unspeakable secret experiments on human beings of all ages, from newborns to the elderly. As a result of these horrific practices, which included vivisections, amputations, and various painful ordeals, 14,000 people died and more than 300,000 suffered lifelong consequences. What did the Japanese doctors do to the Chinese prisoners and even to their own countrymen? What did they call log cabins? The Asian Auschwitz, the terrible secrets of Unit 731. The truth always comes out, even if decades pass. When historians in the 1990s began investigating some of the war crimes committed by Japanese citizens before 1945, they uncovered an unimaginable web of atrocious acts and inhumane treatment of prisoners and civilians. Unit 731 was known until then only as another of the many units of the powerful Imperial Army, but in the 1990s it became known as the Asian Auschwitz. This was by no means an exaggeration, and if one considers the scale of the atrocities rather than the number of people affected, Auschwitz might well be called the European Unit 731. Although both Auschwitz and Unit 731 share a global reputation for atrocities, their approaches and operational structures were radically different. Auschwitz was an industrial extermination complex, designed to maximize the systematic murder of millions of people through gas chambers, crematoriums, and automated logistical processes. Unit 731, on the other hand, was not conceived as a mass extermination center, but as a complex military laboratory where biological weapons were developed through direct experimentation on living humans. The total number of victims at Unit 731 was much lower, but its purpose was not population elimination, but rather the collection of scientific data through extreme medical procedures. Another key distinction lies in their location and camouflage. Auschwitz was located in a semi-urban setting in Poland with a rail network designed for mass deportations. Pingfang, the site of 731, was built in a remote area of Harbin, Manchuria, and was officially presented as an industrial sawmill, allowing its facilities to be hidden for years. While Auschwitz was part of the visible apparatus of the final solution, 731 operated completely below public radar, under multiple layers of military secrecy. Furthermore, Unit 731 was only one component of a broader network of Japanese biological warfare units. Unit 100, located in Changchun, specialized in animal experimentation and agricultural sabotage, testing toxins on livestock and crops. Unit 1644, based in Nanjing, functioned as an auxiliary human testing center but operationally subordinate to Pingfang. Unit 731 spearheaded this network as a strategic, logistical, and scientific hub, with its own transportation system, bacterial production, pressure chambers, freezing chambers, live autopsies, and mass production of microbiological weapons. No other unit, not even within the Axis, matched its level of technical integration for medical and military purposes. Part of the Allied occupation government's propaganda efforts in the post-war years included erasing Japanese war crimes from history. General Eisenhower considered Japan a strategic ally of the United States in the post-war context. Furthermore, they went to great lengths to justify the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as a necessary action provoked by the Japanese, rather than one of the worst acts of mass murder in human history. This was also a strategy of the new democratic Japanese government after 1952, albeit for different reasons. It was a matter of shame for them, and they were unwilling to admit the heinous crimes of the past, even when they had been committed under another administration. However, over time, the truth began to emerge as more historians investigated these little explored aspects of the war. In 1982, the Ministry of Education ordered the suppression of history books that mentioned Japan's military atrocities, which had a considerable impact on international public opinion. This effort was unsuccessful. Some surviving veterans began to speak out and confess to the despicable actions they had carried out during wartime. Many historians began investigating war crimes such as biological warfare experiments, as well as pre-World War II episodes such as the Nanking Massacre. Before World War II, Nanjing was the capital of the Republic of China. Since 1931, the Japanese controlled a portion of the Chinese mainland north of Korea, which they called Manchukuo. For 6 years, the puppet state of Manchukuo and the state of China coexisted. But in 1937, Japan seized the Chinese port city of Beijing, starting a full-scale war with the Chinese. The Imperial Japanese Army managed to take Nanjing on December 13, 1937, after a long and bloody battle with the Chinese National Revolutionary Army. What followed was a full 6 weeks of Japanese soldiers unleashing a wave of mass sexual assaults, looting, torture of prisoners, arson, and senseless murder. The total death toll of Chinese civilians exceeded 200,000, not counting the tens of thousands of assaulted women who survived to live in fear and shame. In this context, the Japanese army saw the perfect opportunity to carry out some of the most repulsive experiments they had ever secretly prepared. An imperial decree gave Unit 731 free rein to do everything in its power to develop biological warfare and experiment on China's civilian population. In total, the unit was directly responsible for 14,000 deaths, but an estimated 300,000 people died indirectly due to infectious diseases caused by the actions of Unit 731. This unit carried out tests of even greater cruelty than Joseph Mengele at Auschwitz. The prisoners of Unit 731 were completely dehumanized and were not even considered people, only disposable test subjects. Experiments included injections of diseases, forced dehydration, vivisection, organ harvesting, and amputations. Some prisoners were placed inside a sealed chamber that was slowly depressurized just to see how much the human body could endure before collapsing. These prisoners were not soldiers captured in combat, but Chinese men, women, children, and even babies kidnapped from the streets of occupied China. Dehumanization of prisoners. What were the infamous log cabins? Unit 731 and its subsidiaries not only regularly performed vivisections on human subjects, but also took pride in the resulting weaponry. The unit's early gruesome experiments at the proving grounds included testing the effectiveness of various bombs on victims tied to stakes, exposing people to extreme cold to document the effects of frostbite on extremities, and exposing them to severe pressure changes to study human limits for aeronautical development purposes. These were just a few of the experiments conducted during the unit's active decade between 1936 and 1945. When scientists needed more victims for human experimentation, they only had to fill out an application detailing the number of subjects needed and, if necessary, their sex and age. Surgeon General Shiro Ishii was the director of Unit 731, and thanks to his prestige, he usually got whatever he asked for. More often than not, the Kwantung Army would make a special human shipment after Ishii's requests were approved. The bound heads of the victims were covered with sacks as they were transported by train and then by vehicles through underground tunnels to the gate of Unit 731 in Harbin, where the experiments would begin. The prisoners awaited their gruesome fates in barracks known as log cabins. Pingfang Complex, headquarters of Unit 731, was designed as a high-security military facility with an architecture that facilitated both research and secrecy. It consisted of more than 70 buildings spread over an area of approximately 6 square kilometers. The facilities were organized into functional zones, detention modules, log cabins, bacteriological laboratories, vivisection areas, biological production factories, decompression chambers, cold storage, weapons stores, personnel barracks, and a functioning crematorium. The facility also included an underground network of tunnels for the discreet movement of prisoners and contaminated waste. To conceal its true purpose, the complex was officially presented as a lumber plant or experimental sawmill, supported by a standard industrial architectural facade. Access routes were controlled by military checkpoints, and the adjacent rail infrastructure allowed for mass transit without public visibility. The perimeter was fenced with electrified barbed wire and guard towers manned by armed guards. This name wasn't due to the material they were built with. In fact, the so-called log cabins were made of brick and concrete. Logs, or Maruta in Japanese, was the name given to the prisoners at Unit 731. The Maruta were not considered human, merely disposable test subjects. Once exhausted by experiments, the Maruta were viewed as useless material and were subsequently killed or left to die of their injuries. The Imperial High Command ordered the construction of a massive complex to house Unit 731 in a district of Harbin known as Pingfang. The Pingfang complex was impressive, resembling a walled city with over 70 buildings spread across a 6-kilometer plot of land. The sheer size of the complex attracted international attention, and when people asked the scientists what the structure was, they would simply reply that it was a sawmill. They weren't lying, as they truly considered the people there to be logs. Pingfang compound, as well as the scientists, the test subjects who arrived at the log cabins had already lost all rights. Their names were never recorded, and upon arrival at the compound they were assigned a number written on the front of their shirts along with the word Maruta. They were referred to only as Maruta number 1, number 2, and so on. They were counted not as one person or two people, but as one log, 2 logs. Being completely dehumanized meant that the prisoners, or Maruta, didn't even have beds to sleep on, as was the case in the Nazi concentration camps. They simply didn't deserve that kind of humane treatment. Instead, they were kept in cages on the top floor of log cabins, which were usually 3 stories high. The cages were called rotsu, from the Japanese word ro, meaning square. The cell block at Pingfang was called rogo for this reason. The area where the prisoners were held was sealed off from the rest of the building with a metal door. 1 meter in front of the door and on the other side of it were disinfectant mats to prevent bacteriological contaminants from being carried outside on the shoes of the scientists and guards. Inside the door, the rooms measured about 10 by 15 meters or 30 by 45 feet and contained several cages in a row. Most of the Maruta in the cages simply lay down as there was no room to stand, and they were usually too tired or sick to sit. In some of the rooms, scientists had placed oil cans containing mice injected with plague germs and fleas feeding on the mice. Various experiments were conducted with fleas and rodents at Pingfang. Around the perimeter of the rooms was a 30-centimeter wide water channel. The purpose of the channel, wider than the distance fleas can jump, was to prevent the fleas from leaving the room. All the Maruta were affected by fleas, but this was the least of their problems. The face of horror, Shiro Ishii, director of Unit 731. Ishii Shiro was born on June 25, 1892 in the village of Chiyoda, about 2 hours from what is now central Tokyo. His family was one of the wealthiest in the region by village standards, with sizable land holdings that gave them the aura of rural aristocrats. This economic status earned them respect and, more importantly, loyalty from the local people. Ishii used this loyalty to his advantage in the years that followed. In 1916, Ishii entered Kyoto Imperial University. It was a prestigious institution, and its medical school was particularly renowned for its work in bacteriology. As a student, Ishii seemed to have personality problems. It is said that he often caused trouble for others. He was aggressive, inconsiderate, and selfish. In keeping with these personality traits, he was also a social climber. He was also known for his fondness for alcohol, his penchant for women, and his embezzlement habits, which his colleagues tolerated. Ishii was described as a vehement nationalist, which helped him gain access to people who could provide him with funding. Ishii felt a calling to the military, not necessarily to serve his country, but to advance his own medical research goals. In 1920, he graduated from college and enlisted in the army. Shortly thereafter, he was promoted to lieutenant, and by the summer of 1922, he had secured a transfer to the 1st Army Hospital in Tokyo. His zeal for research was appreciated by his superiors, and 2 years later he was assigned to return to his alma mater to pursue graduate studies in bacteriology, among other fields. Japan was a signatory to the 1925 Geneva Convention, which outlawed biological and chemical warfare. As a bacteria specialist, Ishii found this development encouraging. He reasoned that if something was bad enough to be banned, then it must certainly be effective. He began to think that chemical and biological weapons could become a valuable asset to the Imperial Army. This way of thinking was very bureaucratic, but for this reason his opinions were always valued by his superiors, and he managed to find support among the Army's senior leadership and in some ministries. Inspired by these advances, Ishii pushed for the creation of a military branch whose activities would focus on biologically based weapons. As an expert in bacteriology, he reasoned that the more important he became to the military, the greater his own importance within the system. Financial considerations provided rationale for his case. Compared with the costs of building, manning, and maintaining huge conventional forces, for example, bacteria and gases were much less expensive. Other advantages emerged later, but the cost factor was a major selling point for Ishii in his appeals to the highest levels of the Imperial Japanese Army. In 1932, a few months after Japanese troops advanced on Harbin, Ishii and his associates followed them, seeing an opportunity to advance their careers. Meanwhile, the Japanese were facing numerically superior Soviet troops along the Soviet-Manchurian border. An armed clash was expected, and Ishii planned to use his expertise to overcome his side's disadvantage. The fact that using biological weapons constituted a war crime did not stop him from proposing it. In 1935, Ishii was promoted to Army Surgeon Major, second class, Surgeon Lieutenant Colonel. On August 1, 1936, Ishii was formally granted control of Unit 731 and its research facilities. This was when his reign of terror began. As the leader of Unit 731, Ishii performed a variety of experiments, most of them personally. This included vivisections, biological weapons, testing on unsuspecting Chinese villages, poisoning Maruta with toxins and gases, and forcing prisoners to infect each other with syphilis. His sense of impunity was so great that he reportedly showed Hideki Tojo, a rising politician who would later become prime minister in 1941, films of the experiments for several years. Tojo found them distasteful and eventually stopped watching them. However, he saw the usefulness of the research Ishii was conducting and so allowed him to continue his experiments at the Pingfang complex. With absolute control of Unit 731, Ishii activated a network of favors that had taken him years to build. His rise was not solely the result of academic merit, but rather a strategy of integration within the bureaucratic and military elites of Imperial Japan. During the first half of the 1930s, he cultivated close relationships with senior general staff officers, including General Hajime Sugiyama, head of the army, and key members of the War Ministry. These connections allowed him to present his biological warfare project as a low-cost, high-return strategic investment, compared to maintaining conventional military divisions. Initial funding for the Pingfang complex came from hidden funds in the Kwantung Army budget, disguised as healthcare infrastructure expenditures. As the project progressed, Ishii managed to secure internal agreements authorizing the diversion of material and human resources from state-controlled military hospitals, technical universities, and chemical industries. The Ministry of Health and Welfare also provided seconded personnel, including microbiologists, pharmacists, and laboratory technicians who operated at Pingfang under the guise of medical research. In addition, Ishii negotiated deals with companies such as Nissan Chemical and Shionogi Pharmaceutical, which supplied laboratory materials, bacteriological cultures, and specialized reagents. Although these companies were not directly involved in human experiments, their logistical links were documented in shipping records and internal correspondence. Political backing was complemented by the active protection of Hideki Tojo, who saw Unit 731 as a tool of strategic power in continental Asia. This combination of political backing, military funding, and unrestricted access to civilian victims allowed Pingfang to grow unrestricted and become the most advanced biological warfare facility in the Japanese Empire. Horrible experiments on women and children. Shiro's main goals, Ishii's goal, was to find a cure for syphilis, a dangerous disease that affected many Japanese soldiers. At first, they infected women with syphilis through injections, but this method didn't produce any real research results. Syphilis is normally transmitted through direct contact, so they followed a system of direct infection through sexual contact. The reason Unit 731 researched venereal diseases was the Japanese Army's practice of using so-called comfort women. It was necessary to protect Japanese soldiers from sexually transmitted diseases, since for any man in the Japanese Army, contracting a venereal disease was a dishonor and a setback. As a result, many infected soldiers kept quiet about their infection and tried to cure themselves in secret. Venereal diseases became a very serious problem in the army. In Siberia, the prices for comfort women were prohibitively high compared to a Japanese soldier's salary, so soldiers took pleasure in sexually assaulting local Russian women. This led to an outbreak of venereal diseases among innocent Russians and Japanese soldiers. Senior officers at Japanese headquarters saw their soldiers succumbing to venereal diseases, and the problem became serious. When Nanking was taken in 1937, 20,000 incidents of sexual assault against Russian women were recorded within a 5-month period. With the spread of venereal diseases among the ranks and the threat it posed to army discipline and efficiency, the High Command called on Unit 731 for help. Infection with venereal diseases by injection was quickly abandoned, and researchers began forcing Maruta to perform sexual acts on each other. Unit members, dressed in white laboratory clothing that covered the entire body, leaving only the eyes and mouth visible, performed the tests. A man and a woman, one of them infected with syphilis, were taken to a cell and forced to have sexual relations with each other. Anyone who resisted was shot. Once the healthy partner was infected, the progress of the disease was closely observed to determine, for example, how far it advanced over time. Instead of looking only at external signs, such as the condition of the sexual organs, researchers could perform live dissections to investigate how different internal organs were affected at different stages of the disease. The victimization of women under Unit 731 was not strictly a matter of scientific interest or gender. It also had a racial basis, as these women were exclusively Chinese, Russian, and Korean. But researchers now believe there was a gender aspect, as women were particularly targeted. Another group targeted were children. Yoshimura Hisato, who later became head of Kyoto Prefectural Medical University, oversaw freezing experiments. He was known as an outstanding scholar and researcher. One of his experiments at Unit 731 was on a 3-month-old baby. A temperature-measuring needle was inserted into the baby's hand, and the infant was immersed in ice water, with temperature changes being carefully recorded. In addition to direct clinical observations, Unit 731 maintained a meticulous system of medical documentation. Each experiment was recorded in individual logbooks which noted physiological parameters, symptom progression, immunological responses, and times of death. Researchers supplemented these logbooks with photographs taken at defined intervals, focusing on the evolution of lesions or skin reactions. Some removed organs were labeled, preserved in formalin or alcohol, and stored in steel trays inside refrigerated chambers. In parallel, histological slides were prepared for later study under optical microscopes. The classification of the results followed a numerical system that replaced the subject's name with their Maruta E-code, allowing large volumes of data to be studied without ever referring to the victim as a person. After the war, he published an article about this experiment and its results. Since it would have been impossible to conduct such an experiment in the post-war years, it became clear that it was carried out while he was working at Unit 731. Hisato used babies born to imprisoned mothers. Chinese records identify babies born to pregnant prisoners and also to women impregnated through forced intercourse in venereal disease experiments, and these babies were also used in the unit's experiments. One of the former researchers who worked with Hisato testified about the horrific conditions under which women were abused at Unit 731. He claimed that one day he was given the keys to the Maruta cells, so he could bring some of them to be experimented on. Instead, he and another member of the unit opened the cell holding a Chinese woman and assaulted her. Unwilling to wait his turn, the other member of the unit opened the cell of a Chinese woman who had been used in a freezing experiment. She was missing several fingers and her bones were blackened with gangrene. He didn't assault her just because he saw that her sexual organ was infected, oozing pus from the surface. Experiments on living persons, vivisection, amputation, organ removal. Each laboratory in Pingfang had a large whiteboard where technicians recorded data. They noted how many Maruta they used, what they injected, and how many organs they needed for future experiments. Since most of the cadavers were in deplorable condition, they preferred to harvest organs from living people. Ethics were non-existent in Ishii's network. Everything was done efficiently in the name of science. Vivisections were performed on humans to observe firsthand how diseases affected each organ at the time of death, since if the patients died, putrefactive bacteria could destroy the results of a successful experiment. Although the Maruta in Unit 731 were chained, their health and nutritional status were monitored as good condition guaranteed the best scientific results for their experiments. They were served a considerable amount of food, including soy and pork. The research methods at Pingfang allowed doctors to induce diseases and examine their effects on organs in their early stages. Researchers worked with interpreters to question Chinese prisoners about emerging symptoms and removed subjects from their cells at what they considered the optimal time to obtain results. Anesthesia was optional. According to a former member of the unit, as soon as symptoms were observed, prisoners were taken from their cells to the dissection room. They were stripped naked and placed on the table, usually while screaming and trying to resist. They were tied up, and one of the doctors stuffed a towel into their mouths, both to silence them and to give them something to bite. Then the head doctor took a scalpel and cut the prisoner open. It was reported that even with the intestines and organs exposed, the Maruta did not die immediately. The physical situation was similar to that of surgery under anesthesia, in which a person is operated on and restored. Vivisection witnesses report that the victim typically emits a horrible scream when the cut is made, and then the voice fades away. Researchers then performed their examination of the organs, removing those they wanted for study and then disposing of what remained of the body. Pingfang Dissection Laboratory had a highly functional infrastructure divided into specific modules. There were at least 4 main rooms, one for subject preparation, another for organ extraction, a third for immediate bacteriological analysis, and a fourth for remains disposal. The dissection tables were metal with inclined drainage and were connected to collection channels that carried fluids to waste tanks treated with quicklime. The instruments included scalpels of various sizes, surgical saws, long forceps, special scissors, and containers labeled for preserving organs according to type and stage of infection. Cleaning of the space was rigorous. At the end of each day, the technical team washed surfaces with caustic solutions and sprayed chlorinated disinfectants on walls and floors, repeating the protocol every 12 hours. The daily routine began at 6 o'clock with the transfer of Maruta from the cells. Between 8 and 12 vivisections were performed per day, depending on the condition of the prisoners and the demands of each project. The anatomical remains were classified. Useful tissue was sent to the bacteriological laboratory, and the rest was incinerated or thrown into lime pits. Everything was documented on numbered forms, cross-referenced with records of temperature, previous symptoms, and pathological evolution observed in vivo. At some point in the process, the victim died, either from blood loss or from the removal of vital organs. The experiments were incredibly cruel and inhumane. Since the subjects were barely Maruta and not human beings, the doctors generally didn't care about their suffering. Sometimes they were given anesthetics, but this was mainly to prevent them from moving and screaming, which could disrupt the doctor's work. Some vivisectionists were not very skilled and used the test subjects as practice specimens. One report mentions a Chinese man who was vivisected without anesthesia. His abdomen was opened, his intestines were cut, removed, and then reattached. Since his condition was stable, the doctors decided to perform 5 more experiments on him, including the amputation of one arm. The entire process took an hour and a half, after which the man died. Ishii's network had also recruited Youth Corps members to perform vivisections. Since wartime Japanese society fostered a sense of nationalism in everyone, children were encouraged to report any anti-war sentiments their parents had to the school principal. The police were then allowed to investigate the parents. Many children were also encouraged by their teachers to join the Youth Corps. Most Youth Corps members were only 15 or 17 years old when they began working at Unit 731. They received rigorous training in biology, foreign languages, mathematics, and bacteriology. Most became assistants to the unit's researchers, where their primary duty was to remove organs from a human body during vivisection. After vivisection, the victims were unrecognizable. Youth Corps assistants were ordered to place their organs in containers. They then used those organs to grow bacteria. It is estimated that around 3,000 people were subjected to human experiments at Unit 731 from 1940 to 1945. However, this is considered a low estimate as the prison's capacity was much larger, and some victims did not survive more than an average of 2 weeks. Operation PX, Japan's secret development of biological weapons. 120 kilometers from Pingfang was an open-air testing ground known as ANTA. This site was used for open-air testing of experimental biological warfare bombs with plague, cholera, and other pathogens, as well as for other forms of human exposure to pathogenic substances under outdoor conditions. The tests generally used between 10 and 40 maruta at a time, with subjects tied to crosses arranged in circles of varying sizes. The tests involved an element of trial and error, and by comparing the results obtained in circles of different sizes, researchers could determine the effectiveness rates at various distances from the points of projectile impact or the release of infected insects. When testing biological warfare bombs, each maruta wore head protection and a metal plate hung around the neck to cover the front of the body. These protective devices prevented death or serious injury that would impede the collection of necessary data. The legs and arms were left exposed so that disease-carrying insects could bite them. In some tests, subjects were tied to vertical planks anchored in the ground at varying distances and patterns from the release points. Careful notes were taken on wind and atmospheric conditions, and each person was marked with a number on their chest during each test to facilitate tracking of the human specimens. In the summer of 1941, Ishii called a conference of all division commanders and reported that an instruction had been received from the Japanese Army Chief of Staff to further develop bacteriological warfare. In particular, the orders called for the large-scale breeding of plague fleas. Plague fleas were of great operational and strategic interest, so orders were given to intensify research work in this field. These were the first steps in what would later become known as Operation PX, a plan to spread plague fleas across the populated west coast of the United States. Also known as Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, it was developed over 3 years. It was scheduled to be launched on September 22, 1945, but the plan was not carried out due to Japan's surrender on August 15. The plan had been carefully prepared over several years. Around 40 rat catchers were sent to scour Singapore for rats and bring their loot back to the laboratory. The rats were then numbed with chloroform, and Youth Corps members worked to extract the fleas from their bodies with tweezers. The fleas were placed in containers of water to prevent them from jumping, and from there, the Japanese personnel took over. Test tubes were prepared with a flea in each. The rats were injected with plague pathogens, their bellies were shaved, and the test tubes were inverted over the shaved area, allowing the fleas to feed on the rats and become carriers of the plague. The bacterial production process within Unit 731 required a highly developed microbiological infrastructure for its time. Technicians worked in airtight rooms with controlled ventilation systems, where bacteria were grown in nutrient-rich media, usually liver extracts or animal brain infusion, which were sterilized and poured into petri dishes and Erlenmeyer flasks. The most common strains included Yersinia pestis, causes bubonic plague, Vibrio cholerae, cholera, Bacillus anthracis, anthrax, and Salmonella typhi, typhoid. Production wasn't improvised, it was carried out according to well-established incubation cycles. Each batch of bacteria was grown for between 24 and 72 hours, depending on the strain, in humid heat incubators and monitored with strict microbiological control protocols. Random tests were performed to verify virulence before moving on to the next step, flea inoculation. The operators wore thick gloves, masks, and rubberized aprons, not for ethical reasons, but to prevent an accidental leak from decimating the staff. Up to 50,000 infected fleas could be produced daily under optimal conditions. This figure contrasted with the bacterial production capacity of contemporary American laboratories such as Camp Detrick, later Fort Detrick, which between 1943 and 1945 barely reached 15,000 vectors per day in their early stages. The Japanese advantage lay in their intensive use of prisoners and the complete elimination of ethical protocols. Pingfang's staff raised fleas under controlled conditions in sealed chambers, feeding them horseblood collected from slaughterhouses affiliated with the facility. Each technician was required to deliver a daily quota of infected adult insects ready to be packaged in special porcelain or metal capsules, which would then be mounted in ceramic bombs developed by the Imperial Navy. The entire system functioned like an assembly line, from rat to insect, from insect to flask, from flask to projectile. This entomological production model surpassed even some of the processes used in the Manhattan Project in automation and efficiency, albeit for completely different purposes. The infected fleas were then transferred to kerosene cans containing sand, dried horse blood, and an unidentified chemical. They were allowed to reproduce for approximately 2 weeks. Finally, the adult fleas and their offspring, all infected with plague, were transferred to jars and shipped. Reports state that as early as 1940, the Suzuki Group Construction Company built a new wing at Pingfang, where the Japanese gathered a group of about 10 prisoners, all over 50 years old. They were instructed to take their belongings to one of the sheds that served as living quarters. Their task was simple and better than the forced labor performed by other prisoners. All they had to do was produce 100 fleas a day and deliver them to the Japanese. The prisoners wore thick, padded clothing and were given 4 rules to obey. Not to come into contact with other prisoners, not to discuss their work with anyone, always sleep with their clothes on, and to perform the work every day. Every week, the Japanese doctors ordered them to remove their padded trousers and tops, turn them inside out, and collect fleas that had grown to about the size of a matchstick. The prisoners were to leave the small fleas on the padding until they grew, and in this way, between 800 and 1,000 fleas were collected each day. 1945, covering the traces of horror. As the end of the war drew near, Japan expected a Soviet advance into Manchuria in northern China. If this happened, the horrors of Unit 731 would be known throughout the world. The Japanese Army High Command issued an order for all facilities of Unit 731 and its subsidiary units to be destroyed to eliminate evidence of their existence and the horrors they had perpetrated. There are no written reports on what to do with the prisoners, so it is believed they were summarily executed and buried in mass graves nearby. Zhongma Fortress, a camp for human experimentation and biological warfare testing, was so well built that its destruction was difficult. Calling it a fortress was no exaggeration. Although the facility was built for research and development purposes, it had the structural strength necessary to withstand attack. Pingfang, a nearby facility in the neighboring city of Dalian, and other units were destroyed, but other facilities remain standing to this day. The imposing building in Nanjing that served as the headquarters of Unit 1644, sometimes known as the Tama Unit, is used today as a hospital. On its second floor, rats and fleas were once bred for Operation PX. Human vivisections were performed at Pingfang, and it also housed a prison. Some of these buildings still stand today. The destruction of evidence in 1945 was a meticulously planned operation by the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff. According to intelligence reports compiled by the Soviets and later by historians, instructions included the incineration of clinical logs, photographs, organic samples, active bacterial cultures, and technical drawings from laboratories in Pingfang, Anta, and Nanjing. All material containing vivisection results, contagion times, pathological evolution, and mortality rates was considered highly sensitive and burned in improvised ovens or incinerators within the complex. However, not everything was destroyed. Some documents were evacuated along with Shiro, Ishii, and senior scientific officers. Some of this documentation, including microfilms with statistics on bacterial propagation and flea distribution maps, ended up in the hands of the U.S. occupation forces following a covert agreement that granted immunity to several members of the unit in exchange for scientific data. Many of these documents were classified in U.S. biological warfare laboratories such as Camp Detrick in Maryland. In terms of infrastructure, although much of the Pingfang complex was demolished or blown up, some structures survived. Among the surviving buildings are a portion of the underground bacteriological containment block sealed by Chinese authorities and visible only in aerial photographs prior to its closure. An 80-meter logistics tunnel, rediscovered in the 1990s, connected the detention area with the weapons testing area. These elements, although isolated, allow a partial reconstruction of the internal workings of Unit 731, and today are part of guided tours at the official memorial site of the Harbin Bacteriological Warfare Museum. In 1945, skeleton crews remained in China to carry out the destruction, while most of the 731st Unit personnel and their families, sensing the Soviet advance, withdrew. The South Manchurian Railway was efficient to the very end. A special train transported the unit members from Harbin and Pingfang, then moved south via the Korean peninsula. After crossing into Japan by sea, they took another special train north via Kanazawa, where some members are said to have used the Noma Shrine as a hideout. The special train continued to Niigata Prefecture, where the members split up and used regular public transportation. Shiro Ishii, the man primarily responsible for the horrors at Unit 731, also fled. He boarded the train in Manchuria with the rest of the staff, but only for a portion of the journey. During that train ride, he gave specific instructions to his subordinates. He told them not to accept jobs in public offices, not to contact one another from that moment on, and, most importantly, to take their secrets to the grave. Most complied with everything Ishii asked of them. Ishii personally handled certain details. He took films and records with him, destroying some but flying others back to Japan. Later, Douglas MacArthur convinced the American government that Ishii was a valuable asset to the United States, so he was granted immunity in exchange for information about Japanese involvement in the war. He was allowed to continue his research in biological warfare and is said to have assisted the U.S. Army during the Korean War. After returning to Japan, Ishii opened a medical clinic where he provided examinations and treatment free of charge. He died in 1959, and his successors published a diary he kept, but it made no reference to any of his wartime activities with Unit 731. When Emperor Hirohito signed the surrender agreement documenting the end of the Japanese Empire, an order was issued that no survivors were to be left and all captives were to be killed. By the time the Soviets arrived at Pingfang, they found only a destroyed facility with caged animals, human remains, and most of the personnel already evacuated. Today, remnants of the fortress still remain at Pingfang, preserved as a monument to human inhumanity. Japanese war crimes have been in many ways more prolonged and horrific than those of the Nazis in Europe. Unit 731 under the barbaric Surgeon General Shiro Ishii had no regard for human life, especially when it came to women, children, and foreigners. Hundreds of thousands of human beings suffered horribly at the hands of these bloodthirsty doctors who stopped at nothing in their race to develop deadly biological weapons with which to conquer the world. Harry S. Truman's decision to drop atomic bombs on the Japanese home islands has been widely criticized, but it cannot be denied that it stopped these evil Japanese experiments in their tracks. The ruins of the Pingfang complex still stand today, a testament to the horrors of war and the depravity of which humankind is capable.